It's our March panel on gender equality. We have with us Dr. Lisa Baldez from Dartmouth College, and we have Vermont Senator, is it Kesha or Kesha?
It's Kesha, like Croatia.
Kesha Ram with us, speaking on the topic of gender equality, which is also a part of the beginning of our celebration of Women's History Month. And with that, I will turn it over to our speakers.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks, Kelsey, for inviting me. It's really nice to be here today. So you guys have been focusing on the SDGs, and the SDGs are amazing in terms of setting out really specific goals for the world, for girls and women in the world. Eliminate discrimination, end gender violence, value household labor, ensure equal leadership participation, ensure economic participation, equal rights to economic opportunity. And in order to achieve those goals, you need to work on all fronts, right? You need to work at the local, you need to work at the global, you need to work in politics, you need to work in civil society, in schools, in NGOs, in organizations, in families, in the media, at all these different levels. And you see this we have that in the United States. We're very lucky to have a free and flourishing civil society and a very vibrant political arena. And we have been very successful in making progress toward the SDGs. We have many women elected into elective office, and Senator Ram, it's really nice to meet you, and an honor, and congratulations on being the first woman of color and the youngest woman in history elected to the Vermont State Senate. That's really terrific, and thank you for the work that you do and have done for Vermont. So there's lots of activity happening in the United States to work toward the SDGs, but the United States is missing or lacking a key tool to make progress. And that tool is something that nearly every country in the world already has in place. And that is that nearly every country in the world has ratified the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is known as CEDAW. The United States is one of 6 countries that have not ratified CEDAW. Those countries are Iran, Palau, Somalia, Sudan, and Tonga. And they're very fine countries, but they're not typically the kind of company the United States considers as peer countries, certainly not with regard to the status of women. CEDAW, if those of you are not familiar with it, is really one way to think about it. It's an international Bill of Rights for women. And it lays out a very general set of goals and aspirations for ending discrimination against women in all arenas of society. It was approved by the United Nations General Assembly in 1979. And if you follow the United Nations and you follow women's rights or any issue at the United and global level, you know that there are hundreds of declarations and resolutions and statements and agreements with regard to the status of women and women's rights. What makes CEDAW distinctive, it is actually as a convention or a treaty, it requires countries obligate themselves to a binding agreement to make progress toward the goals of articulated in CEDAW. So it has the force of international law. And there's a lot of research that has looked at CEDAW and actually establishes that ratification of CEDAW is associated with all kinds of, with progress on women's rights and women's equality in all kinds of arenas. So CEDAW is an important tool. It's one that the United States does not have. And I just want to talk briefly about why the United States hasn't ratified it and kind of what it would mean for the United States if we did ratify it, and then what's happening at the local level, which I think would be a great segue to Senator Ram. So as I said, CEDAW was approved by the General Assembly in 1979. And the 1970s in the United States were a period of unusually high agreement between the Democratic and Republican parties about the status of women. Throughout most of the 1970s and before that, a couple of decades, both parties agreed on many policies with regard to the status of women: equal pay, pregnancy discrimination. Both parties supported the Equal Rights Amendment, or ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, And there was a lot of consensus. And it was that consensus between among political leaders that actually allowed the United States to have play a very active role in drafting CEDAW. And in 1979, when it was passed, it looked like the United States would just pass this as a matter of course. It was first presented to the world at the World Conference on Women, which was held in Copenhagen that year. And one of the representatives from the United States who was there said, this is going to change the world. Like, we're going to ratify CEDAW, and, a wave of change is going to come sweeping through. But that was precisely the moment at which the parties began to divide very forcefully on women's rights. And I am happy to talk about that history if anybody wants to. But my sense is that the divisions between the Democratic and the Republican Party on issues of regard to women are probably familiar territory to most of you. But I'm happy to talk about that. So those divisions increased over time. They became increasingly focused on abortion and access to abortion. And there was a concern by the Republicans that ratification of CEDAW would facilitate liberalization of abortion laws in the United States. The Democrats, at the same time, while they supported CEDAW, and there have been many hearings within the Senate, which oversees ratification of treaties, aimed at ratification of CEDAW. And it's come close a couple of times over the last 40 years, but has never quite made it. One of the problems there is that the Democrats have focused on the impact that U.S. ratification of CEDAW would have for women in other countries. And that is a noble cause, and I think it's true. If the United States ratified CEDAW, it would elevate the status of the treaty, and that would be good for the status of women in all countries if we were to throw our support behind it. But that's a hard issue to mobilize around. People are more likely to mobilize in support of legislation when they see how it could affect them individually and personally. And those kinds of arguments really haven't been made. So what would CEDAW do if we ratified it as a country? And let me just say at the outset, you may ask, do you think we're likely to ratify it? My answer is no. I think it's likely to come up. I think it will likely to be addressed, but the level of opposition to it is quite fierce, and I don't see that happening. I'm happy to talk more about that. So what would it mean for the U.S.? So the Republicans, as I said, have a vision of CEDAW kind of overriding domestic policymaking and allowing the United Nations to kind of dictate U.S. domestic policy. And they have particular concerns with regard to reproductive rights issues. That's not true. That's not how the treaty works. The ratification of the treaty doesn't automatically result in the passage of policies or changes in domestic policy. By the same token, arguments that the Democrats have made also suggest that ratification of CEDAW is going to kind of automatically change policy for the status of women in other countries. But really what ratification of this treaty would do is commit the United States to a couple of things: to take action to move toward compliance with its provisions and move toward meeting the SDGs. Every 4 years, each country that ratifies the treaty has to prepare a report. That's a comprehensive report that looks at the degree to which the particular country is in compliance with the provisions of the treaty. And that is something that the United States has never done. We have never sat down and written a report to say, here's the status of women in the entire country. Here's all the different policies. We've done that certainly with regard to some policies, but not the whole spectrum of policies that affect women. And that in and of itself, I think, could be a really useful exercise. Once you write that report, the country sends a delegation to the United Nations. This particular group meets in Geneva and you report every 4 years. And a delegation of people from the government answer questions in front of a committee of experts called the CEDAW Committee about what they said in their report, about issues that non-governmental organizations might raise, about points of comparison with other countries. And so it's a way of holding countries accountable to the binding treaty that they signed and this commitment to compliance. And that in and of itself, having to stand before a committee of experts and on the world stage and having to defend your policies with regard to the status of women is also a very powerful exercise that sheds some scrutiny on commitment to women's rights policy that I think could be very valuable. And really, that is kind of the extent of what I see as being the real impact of ratification of CEDAW. Other things may come from that, but the obligation is really that we show up, that we report, and that we move toward compliance, and we kind of periodically report on our progress. Now, in the 40 years that advocates of CEDAW have tried to mobilize to ratify it, to persuade the Senate to approve it, a number of people have become frustrated with the process of ratification in Congress and have begun to say, we're going to forego the effort to mobilize to ratify CEDAW at the national level, at the federal level, and we're going to simply try to adopt CEDAW statutes and CEDAW ordinances at the local level. So there are something like, at my last count, about 50 cities across the United States that have ratified CEDAW ordinances or provisions. And there's a lot of variation in terms of what they do, but really what they do, and they're not, they don't go to the UN to report, right? They're cities, they're kind of making a commitment to the principles of the treaty, but not actually parties to the treaty, is basically saying, we will review the policies that we pass, the legislation, the decisions that we make at the executive level, and we will adjudicate on the degree to which these measures do or do not promote gender equality in the provisions of CEDAW. And this is there's been a lot of interest in this, in part because of the frustration with not being able to work through Congress and the partisan disputes over the status of women. And so CEDAW, even if just conceptually and kind of a document or a manifesto, a list of women's rights to achieve, can be really useful at the local level. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of impact. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer questions, but I really love to hear from Senator Ram about what she's up to these days.
Well, thanks so much, Professor Baldez. I learned a lot from listening to you because it's not the world we live in at the global level when we're feeling quite myopic on state government and how we are benefiting Vermonters in our work here in the state Senate. But at the same time, we are constantly looking for best practices about how to better measure what success and the advancement of women looks like. And I am new to the Government Accountability Committee, which is just starting to take all state data that we collect and disaggregate it by race and gender, which I think will help us in a lot of ways to look at where we are falling short, which is many places. And, just to give one highlight from our information. So I serve on the Senate Economic Development Committee, and women in Vermont right now make up 70% of unemployment beneficiaries. The high during the pandemic was 75% of unemployment beneficiaries were women. That is wildly disparate from other states. So even other states that had a disparity, it was about 55-45 between men and women. Vermont's huge outlier status is still really hard to explain, even though we know that a lot of it has to do with women being highly overrepresented in the food service and hospitality sectors, and this being a pandemic that is called a she-cession because of the effect on childcare and families. But at the same time, other states have those problems and don't have the same outlying status that we do. So we've been really trying to dig in with very imperfect information about where that comes from. And it's involved even trying to ask constituents for their qualitative sense of what's happening. But of course, then it's still really hard to compare with the rest of the country. What are we doing that's not working for women? And at the same time, we know we just have kind of really consistently high demand for the employment of men. in, certain sectors where we have not done enough to advance women into those high demand sectors as well. So whereas, we know that Vermont is very similar to other states, that a majority of our frontline workers are women and a majority of our minimum wage workers are women, we haven't helped them break various glass ceilings into other occupations and roles that really give them more of a boost into stability, the middle class, and being able to fully support their families. I hate to just be full of statistics here, but we know, for example, that women make up 1/3 of the people in Vermont who identify as business owners, which is a very high proportion to have women identifying as entrepreneurs. And yet at the same time, they only represent 9% of the revenue of those businesses. So they are high number of people who want to be working flexibly. There's a sort of dream of being self-made or being your own boss because it allows you flexibility for your family and other pursuits. And yet they're still not making nearly the same revenue from their business ventures that men are in the state. So what does that mean in terms of their access to capital and access to mentors and relationships and networks that help them grow their business and sell their product or services? So, that's a lot of what we try to pay attention to in the state. My dog is just upset because it's right after 4 o'clock and this is when she wants to be fed. So I apologize. But this is a lot of what we try to pay attention to in the state. And I had the privilege, I served 8 years in the House of Representatives in Vermont from the age of 22 to 29. And now, have the privilege of being the youngest woman in history in the state Senate. I came into the House in 2009 at the start of the Great Recession, which was another sort of moment to run into a burning building and say, what are we doing for women specifically? Because a lot of the conversation at the time was about shovel-ready projects and infrastructure and male-dominated work programs. And we had to stage like a near walkout in the legislature of the women because there was not going to be prioritization of measuring who benefited from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds coming to the state, and how much were we ensuring that women were equally involved in recovering and equally able to recover from the recession. We are going to have the same problem with this pandemic, is having such a disproportionate impact on women. If our solutions aren't geared toward women, we're going to find ourselves with similar problems and women being set back even further by what just happened. So some of those solutions include things that we've known have always been important for women and families to have access to: paid family leave, so that they don't have to choose between their job security and their ability to take care of a family member or raise a child. The access to childcare has been a huge issue, specifically in Vermont as well. So, we need real investment in access to quality, affordable childcare for Vermonters, and that's going to take a lot of state money. We tend to be much more invested in K through 12, which is not a bad thing, but that leaves out a lot of opportunities to help people retool and reinvest in themselves through early childhood education, and their need to, have their children taken care of at an age when many women slip into poverty when their children are quite young. And if they were able to better access higher education to retool post-pandemic particularly, and find access to a new job. We've learned through the pandemic that many jobs aren't coming back. We're looking at an economy that will rapidly change, even though it might have been coming gradually. And that is going to have impacts on women and the need for training and support. So that's just a flavor of how we're thinking locally about these international goals. And I will say, Vermont is now the last state in the country to have never sent a woman to Washington. We've had one female governor. We've had a small handful of women who have served statewide in what we call the constitutional roles, like attorney general, treasurer, lieutenant governor, and governor. And our legislature has often been, rich with gender diversity and having more women in the legislature. We're often in the top 5 in the percentage of women in the legislature. But that is a very leaky pipeline to having mayors and other officials at the state level. So we tend to not be able to turn that rich gender diversity in the legislature into much more beyond that in terms of leadership. And that has frustrated us for a long time. One of the things I'll end with that I really like to say to young women is that when you look around the country, when you think about people in elected office from local school board all the way to Congress, about 5% of all of those elected officials have been under the age of 35. And when you look at the elected officials that have been under the age of 35, about a quarter of that 5%, so like 1.5% of all elected officials are women under the age of 35. Now, when you get to Congress, over half of the elected officials in Congress started in office when they were under 35. So, you know, it's a small but select group that really sticks with government, gains the name recognition and popularity to make it all the way to Washington. Those are largely white Christian men. And guess who they like to make the most laws about? Women under the age of 35 and their economic opportunity and their bodies. So you have to be thinking really long term about how you shape future leadership. And we, in many ways, have not invested in making sure women take leadership roles at a young age so that they can continue to grow their influence and change the shape of the country and the influence that they have when they're older in policy realms. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much. We'll open it up to questions now. You can either ask it out loud in the call or you can pop it in the chat. Taylor, go ahead.
I can't remember the acronym exactly, but whatever you were talking about. Do you know what in, yeah, that, do you know what, there we go. Do you know what inclusions they have for trans women and intersectionality in terms of that, and also women of color taken into account?
It's a super interesting question. One way to remember how to pronounce the name of the treaty comes from Republican Senator, no, it's Trump Thurman, from North Carolina. Can't believe his name is not coming to me, but he said he did not like CEDAW, and he would talk about it very sarcastically. And he said CEDAW rhymes with hee-haw in a famous speech that he gave about it. So the treaty itself, as it was written in the 1970s, doesn't address quite a few things. There's no mention in the treaty of anything regarding to trans or people of color, or even sexual orientation. It doesn't mention violence against women. And that reflects the status of that issue as it was thought about in the 1970s. It was just beginning to come onto the political agenda. And it really wasn't until the mid-80s that violence against women became kind of the global issue in the global arena in the United Nations. That said, the treaty has this committee that oversees its implementation. It's a treaty, 24 people who are elected officials by the countries that have ratified CEDAW, oversee the interpretation of the treaty, and they have issued a series of what are called general recommendations that are kind of like a jurisprudence aimed at guiding how to think about the provisions, which are intentionally, I mean, you can imagine, you know, however many countries there were in the UN at the time, I'm not sure, but over 100, negotiating the terms of this treaty. And in order to get agreement across those countries, the provisions of CEDAW are written in quite vague language. So this committee has overseen a series of provisions to kind of specify, okay, and by this we mean this. And of course, you know, we think violence against women needs to be taken into account in adopting every single one of the articles. And issues regard to LGBTQ people and issues of sexual orientation have had a lot of traction within the United Nations. The degree to which countries comply with those recommendations is an interesting question. In political science, we would call that an empirical question. Like, that's a research project that someone could do, and I don't think has been done, to look at exactly what that has meant in CEDAW. But I know that it's something that they have put on their agenda and are addressing. But what I don't know is what that looks like.
Aziz, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I first want to thank you both for a really educative and really broad look at what is happening in the realm of women's rights. And I appreciate kind of the discourse that both of you had around how this is both a legal issue and a cultural issue. And it makes me think of the late Sally Engle Mary, who talked a lot about CEDAW and kind of the cultural aspect of it. And I want to quote a little bit from Engle Mary's book, Culture and Transnationalism. Considerable research on law and everyday social life shows that law's power to shape society depends not on punishment alone, but on becoming embedded in everyday social practices, shaping the rules people carry in their heads. And I guess my question for both of you is, how do we translate what is kind of a global discourse of women's rights to the local level of the United States, and then change the culture and mentality of how we view women in this country?
You start.
Okay, great. I'm happy to start. Sometimes people freeze for me on Google Meet, so I'm like, is someone about to jump in? So thanks for the really thoughtful question. And I think a lot about how culture eats policy for breakfast, or however the sayings go, just to recognize that we all the best data and, policy language in the world doesn't really stack up to much if it's not really embedded in people's hearts and minds, and they're not buying into those principles and ideas. I think, a good example of that is a lot of what's happened in the pandemic, right? We are a country with a lot of tools at our disposal to be able to keep people safe, and yet we have had such a disproportionately high rate of deaths and infections, and particularly among our Black Americans. And that just goes to show in a lot of ways that we as a country should be quite ashamed of the things like the Black maternal health rate, ways that our culture that's built on the legacy of slavery and the erasure of Indigenous people really leads to some wildly disparate outcomes in for women of color versus white women. And so when we look at our country as a whole, we think we're doing okay, even though we know we're not doing great for a developed nation. But when you pull those statistics apart and disaggregate them by race, you then show that we are, at undeveloped nation status in many ways in how Black and brown women fare in this country, and Black and brown children. So, I'm constantly trying to think of ways that we can look at those disparities and think about how we change the culture to care more and to prioritize that more. Vermont, for example, the Black COVID infection rate was 10 times higher than the white Vermonter COVID infection rate in October of the pandemic. And that was before the outbreak that was detected with Jamaican farm workers in Champlain orchards. So, we then had to look at, how do we fix our language access? How do we, pay young people in the new American communities to be able to translate this information and build trust? How do we look at a history and an ongoing legacy of mistrust of our healthcare systems? How do we tackle systemic racism and how people are treated in healthcare facilities and by medical professionals? The differences that we have in how we perceive Black people, and particularly women, to experience pain, and just how do we grapple with people deprioritizing the suffering of Black people in Vermont and the country. That is very hard to do through policy. And, I'm still constantly reminded that, as Martin Luther King once said, and I'll paraphrase, the law can't require someone to love me, but they can keep them from lynching me, and that became really important in a pandemic where we were saying these are the best health practices, that science can offer us right now, and we should be implementing those. And people didn't really care enough about one another, or the people that they knew were going to be most vulnerable to the pandemic, to follow those laws or to implement those laws in states where they didn't feel like implementing them. We have states opening up in major ways right now, in a way that is, going to result in more deaths and devastation before everyone gets the vaccine. So how we deal with that, I look at things like ongoing research of, now we're at a point in the country where many Republicans would disown their children if they married a Democrat and vice versa. That number used to be quite low, that they would be fine if, their children married into a different political party. That's become at the point of a religion or an ethnicity now in the country, where people would be very upset with their family members for marrying someone of a different political party. Those kinds of ongoing trends are a cultural shift in the country that's informed by media, what we consume, in terms of access to television. Are we watching the same programs? Are we hearing the same stories? Are we sympathetic to the same people? And that is, a great source of division and a very problematic element, I think, of our culture that we have to be dealing with. And it affects all of us. It affects us with what we choose, where we choose to put our attention, where, if we are looking at social media and cocooning ourselves in opinions that we agree with, that is going to start to deeply affect our ability to govern in this country.
When I'm driving on the highway and I come across a construction project, I get really mad because I know that construction project is a federal, it's federal transportation money, and that is going predominantly to benefit men. Most of the people working on a construction project on our nation's highways are men. And when I heard you, Senator Ram, say that you guys fought hard in the wake of the 2009 economic crisis to make sure that women were included in the relief money that was coming through that, it just was like, oh, that's just, it makes me really happy to hear that. What I wonder, and this gets to your question, Aziz, I think, is, CEDA may be a little remote, but what if there was a law that said, every single item in the budget of the state of Vermont has to go through some kind of gender-based, it's called gender-based budgeting. And that sounds like that's what the direction you're moving in without a law to that accord. Would a law like that make a difference? And then would it make a difference without people like Senator Ram, pushing to make sure that it is implemented and enforced in the way that it was intended, to make sure that it's not forgotten, it's not left by the wayside? And I think about that tension between formal law and the kind of the presence of young women on the floor of the legislature. Those are two different forces, and I don't think either one of them is sufficient in order for a law to become embedded in that everyday way. I think you really need both. And thank you so much for mentioning Sari Engel Mary. I love her work, and I didn't know that she had passed away. So there you go.
I really appreciate it. The kind of piece that I was referring to specifically in the treaty was Article 5, which asks that we modify the social and cultural patterns and conduct of men and women. And another excellent scholar, Dr. Elizabeth Sepper, writes a bit about this and essentially says that there are, even the most progressive of Western states, regardless of legal opportunities, significant cultural pressures from friends, family, media, schools to act a certain way, or not even be recognized as female as well, right? So the discourse around, women who pursue careers, being perceived as selfish or bad mothers versus men who are perceived as self-sacrificing or good breadwinners. So I really appreciate both of your responses, because I think it is, like you both said, a nexus of changing law, changing perceptions, and then changing actions, right? So thank you both very much.
Yeah, and I just want to add a great example of that is in paid family leave law. states that, and countries, essentially, I should say, because few states in the US have actually advanced paid family leave anywhere near where it is in Europe. Many of the countries that have paid family leave, it's parental, or it's just clear that it's supposed to be equally shared. And in some cases, it's mandated that it's equally shared across genders, so that you don't disadvantage women in the workplace by saying, oh yeah, they get much more time off, so we don't want to hire them. Or, we're afraid to sort of have them in our workplace and know that they're going to be culturally the one that takes the leave anyway. Sometimes you have to mandate that it has to be shared equally to change culture even. And that would be a non-starter in the US, because our culture, is so masculine in a way that I think it's dead set against someone telling you have to take time off to take care of your child. And yet that would probably be the best way to start to change these norms about who the caregivers are. So, it is an interplay between what we would even accept in policy because of how much our culture informs our belief about what is radical or not.
Taylor, you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question about the whole thing about getting young women into positions of power, but also I'm a former computer science student, so I was a young girl in STEM. So what your perspective is on what you can do locally in terms of like school, state, country, all levels, to help promote women in STEM and leadership.
Lisa, do you want to start?
Sure. So this is a huge topic of research within political science in particular. What are the conditions that lead to the election of women? And one of the most kind of robust and consistent findings is that one thing that works a little bit differently for women than it does for men is that women are more likely to run for office if you ask them to think about it. And I gather that might be part of your story, Senator Ram. Because women, and here's the stereotypes and the education, tend to undervalue their strengths, their skills, their contributions. But if you say, no, I think you'd be great, I think you'd do a really great job, that can make a big difference. So there's all kinds of ways, I think, and I practice this as a professor, of how I talk to people, to kind of talk to them in ways that open up possibilities and kind of trigger their aspirations in a way, to kind of reaffirm my belief in people's potential, to counter lots of messages to the contrary. But simply asking is statistically shown to have a big impact.
Yeah, that is, we follow that line of thinking in politics all the time. You have to ask a woman 7 times to run for office for her to believe that people think she's qualified to do it. Women, don't wake up and look at themselves in the mirror and think, I should run for office. And, they're not given a lot of models to build from. Now that we do have them, it opens up a whole realm of possibility for women to see themselves represented, to see that they can really be more of their full selves and bring that to the table. I mean, being the first woman of color means a lot to me. We have the first transgender woman and openly transgender woman serving in the Vermont House of Representatives. These are ways, and now, I'm talking to women all over the state who identify as BIPOC who are running for office. In Winooski, where we have our first openly transgender legislator, Taylor Small, she was able to recruit openly transgender woman to run for city council in Winooski. So, it really, it's not just women seeing other women, it's single moms seeing other single moms, and, people from all different backgrounds being able to see my story would not be, pioneering, because not everybody wants to do that. People want to know that they can, simply follow a path that has been trod before them. And that's still very challenging if women don't see themselves represented with different intersectional identities in different leadership roles. So, you know, and not only, like you said, women in STEM. I mean, I was just went for a socially distanced walk with a friend who is an engineer who just hired his first woman engineer, and he's figuring out everything he can do to keep her on his payroll and staff. And he knows that he has to be a really good listener if she comes back from a job where she feels like she was sexually harassed or treated differently. You know, he has to be paying attention to really different needs she might have, just like a woman of color might need to hear that you understand the intersections of racism and sexism. You know, that we saw a lot of people in the pandemic protesting that they needed to go get their hair done. Well, that's a reality that a lot of Black women face all the time in rural places like Vermont, where somebody has to drive up from Boston so that they can look and feel professional or good about, you know, their appearance. And so these are a lot of silent issues that specific groups face that we need to bring out into the open so they feel, oh, I'm not alone. You know, I am facing something that's not unique to me. It's a textbook case of sexual harassment or gender bias or something like that. So they have more tools and partners to combat that.
As a still computer science and very hopefully senior year graduating with computer science, it was definitely an interesting experience to start out freshman year with not many, which I wasn't expecting, or not expecting, I guess was more correct. Just a few women, but people I knew, and then semester after semester and year after year, there's just fewer and fewer, and I think there's maybe one or two other girls graduating. Yeah, Taylor left me alone. Graduating with that, I think there's more than, you know, I'm just haven't been in classes with, but it feels very isolating. So you definitely get that there's nobody, and especially in the pandemic where you're not in class with anybody and you sometimes literally don't see anybody. So you don't see other people who are like you in your field. I guess I wanted to take it back a little briefly to CEDA. I had a question about the committee you talked about, Dr. Baldez. I was wondering what makes these experts, how do they determine who is an expert, who's qualified to judge those reports? Are they at the same committee for the most part every time, or is it a new committee every 4 years? How do they really determine that?
So there are 24 people. As I said, they are, if your country has ratified CEDA, you have the opportunity to nominate someone to serve on that committee. And then all the state delegations vote from among those who are nominated. And for some countries, it's a really big deal to say, you know, the Netherlands, I think recently got someone on the committee, and you know, people mobilized to support her campaign. They campaigned for her. And that means you have a seat at the table. Who the people are, I think it tends to be people who have a lot of lawyers who have a background in one or more aspects of women's rights or equality law. It's changed over time. I taught a class on CEDA, and one of my students was like, I'm going to run. And even though the United States wasn't a member, like pursued it to see how far he could get, just in terms of making it, just to see, you know, how that process works. And that's one of the arguments for U.S. ratification, that the U.S. does not have a seat at the table. We don't even have a chance of having the seat at the table to determine things like, you know, how do trans people, how to get to be interpreted within the confines of this treaty. We're not present in those conversations. And one of the reasons that I started writing about CEDA was because most of my work in the past has been on Latin America. And in Latin America, CEDA is very much part of the policy environment. It is written into national laws, national constitutions. It is something that countries have a lot of familiarity. They send huge delegations of like 40 people to the CDOC committee to present their country's report. They have follow-ups. They're very conscious of it. Non-governmental organizations use it to kind of pressure governments. So it's very much part of the policy world. I would give talks about that, and I would say, offhand, oh, by the way, the United States hasn't ratified this treaty, and I started getting really interested in why that was the case. So elsewhere in the world, it's a big deal.
I have another question. This one's more for Senator Ram, but if you want to weigh in, Dr. Baldez, that's fine. Why do you think Vermont specifically, but we certainly see it in other places as well, has such a rich and diverse local legislature, but it doesn't really cross into the national? Is it because there's just not as many positions, and men still seem to be the priority, or is there another reason?
Well, we could certainly look at a lot of different factors, but the unfortunate reality is, while Vermont does fairly well in terms of women in the legislature, that's just sort of one indicator of overall gender parity in our elected offices. And we weren't tracking a lot of that until very recently. So, for example, only a third of our local elected officials, like school boards and city councils and select boards, only a third of those are people who identify as women. We have 8 mayoral seats in the state, which also is, like you said, a feeder into that bottleneck of, okay, we don't have that many executive roles in the state to begin with, or high-level leadership positions. So of the 8 mayorships we have in the state, there's only also been a handful of women. Burlington, again, has never had a female mayor, and there are a couple other towns that have never had a female mayor either. So we don't have a whole lot of a pool that we're drawing from, except that legislative greater gender parity, which has really exploded more recently. We have, for the first time, the women are leading in all facets of the legislature. So you have a female Speaker of the House, female President pro tem, who's also the first openly gay woman to serve in either of those roles. And then you have women as majority leaders in both the House and the Senate. You have a new, the first woman of color in the state Senate. You have a female lieutenant governor. So you have a lot of positions where all of a sudden we're saying, hey, we're here as women. First of all, that, we still see in polls that a lot of people say, well, it doesn't really matter to me what the gender of my leader is. That's still a commonly pervasive attitude in Vermont. So people saying, I don't know that I need the next person going to Washington to be a woman necessarily. That might not be that different than other states like New Hampshire, but New Hampshire still at one point sent every single person in those high-level roles was a woman. They sent women to Washington in the Senate seats and the House seats, and they had a female governor. So they had like a triple crown over there, while we had none of the above. And so part of it is really, you have to wonder, we have a hard time chipping away at those visible role models of who has made it. And so we also keep putting roadblocks in the way of women. I remember, in the past, when people were talking about who should run for governor or some position, I was very flattered to be in some long Facebook thread of a lot of women I respect who were saying, oh, I really like Kesha Ram, but, she's a little too young. And someone was like, I really like Sue Minter, but she might be a little too old. And it's like, my goodness, like, what is the exact perfect age you have to be to hold an elected office and be an executive in Vermont? Governor Madeline Kunin is one of the dearest people in my life. She's a great mentor and friend, but she's constantly musing, like, what was the secret sauce for me? And what does it take for Vermonters to see a woman in those leadership roles? They're constantly waiting for the perfect person to come along. And that is really stymieing us in Vermont. But I think we're starting, I've seen more articles and attention looking at our federal delegation and saying, we love these guys, but we have 3 older white men, and it's starting to become obvious when you look at the rest of the country and the other elected officials that are exciting people in Congress and in the Senate and in the White House. Things are changing, and I think that visualization in comparison is starting to become a more obvious conversation point in Vermont. But we do only have one member of Congress, as you pointed out, whereas, that other states tend to have at least two, like New Hampshire. So our bottleneck is pretty severe.
Can I ask you a question, Senator Ram?
Oh, sure.
I'm curious about how you navigate in a context of partisan polarization, and how that affects you, and kind of how you just how you deal with it on a day-to-day basis. I have some friends in the New Hampshire state legislature, and I'm proud of them, but I'm also curious and concerned.
Yes. I don't know if I could survive in New Hampshire's legislature, given its current polarization.
Literally survive.
You literally survive, literally maskless marauding and all kinds of stuff going on over there that, is very different than our culture in Vermont. I have a good friend who is not only a woman of color in the New Hampshire legislature, but she originally is from India. And there's a lot of xenophobia that crops up every time that she runs, that she perseveres through. She perseveres through being marginalized in the legislature as a woman of color of international origin. So I sometimes feel like I have it pretty good here in Vermont, where we still celebrate the bipartisan or nonpartisan nature of a lot of our decision making. And I would like the culture to stay that way, but not at the expense of, fear of open conflict or right to comfort for certain people over the real urgent needs of others. So it's a constant balance, but it is pretty remarkable in this country right now to say that we gave, President Joe Biden his largest margin of victory of our electorate in the country. And we also elected a Republican governor by a record-breaking margin at the same time. So we're very proud of kind of our checks and balances that we put on ourselves and our own government officials of wanting to have a largely Democratic legislature and a Republican governor and a socialist senator. We tend to put our eggs in a lot of baskets. And I think that forces us in many ways to look beyond party to what Vermonters are really asking us to do for the people. So I personally, having grown up in California, which is a pretty blue state, I still feel like, not to offend any Californians as a native of California, but common sense really prevails in Vermont in a way that you don't see in a lot of other places. And so, I try not to be partisan for the sake of being partisan, but really have come to the legislature at a young age when people said, hey, there's something that gets everybody up in the morning and keeps them up at night. And you want to figure out what that is, because you can find common ground with anybody. And that was not only great political advice, but it was very personally enriching, such that I'm getting married this summer, and I have the happy problem of like, I'm going to sit Democrats with Republicans, and we're going to see how things go that night. But like I was saying earlier, when political party becomes akin to religion or ethnicity and how much it divides people, we have a serious problem to contend with. So, I have constantly tried to find common ground with people, but what we have in Vermont leaking in is that national rhetoric that is much more kind of soundbite and knee-jerk. And we have, I would say more Republicans right now trying to bring that national rhetoric into our conversation, telling young people who are upset about bills like, flag bans. So you can't have the Black Lives Matter flag or the Pride flag up at your school. That's a bill that was introduced by Republicans. Feels largely symbolic and sort of attacking people of certain identities. And we've heard reports that when people reach out to them, some of them have said, grow up or get a life, in response to people. That's just not the Vermont way of doing things that I was taught, that you end conversations that way, especially in the people's house as a people's advocate. So, I think there's a culture worth maintaining here, but we still have to balance it with, well, who gets to feel the sort of dignity of the role and who is being left out by, the culture and the way we do things. So it's a constant balance.
That's really cool to hear. Thanks.
I suppose now is a good time for my political science question for you, Dr. Baldez, and you as well, Senator Rahm, if you have a thought on it. We were talking about the split between the political parties that we saw in the late 70s, early 90s, which is certainly not the first split we've seen, but definitely the most polarizing to date, I would say. It's not a one answer, I know for sure, but what would you say are some of the causes in relation to women's issues? Because I feel like we do keep coming back to that polarizing issue of Republicans versus Democrats, and then the Democrats aren't very united on it, and so nobody's together, and we're all scrambled everywhere. So what would you say really started that split that we see only grow?
And the just general partisan polarization?
Yeah, I suppose.
With regard to women's issues?
Both, but maybe specifically women as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is a rich and vibrant area of study. Every day, something new comes out. I think this is not a political science answer. It's just my kind of general observation about it that has to do with the changing economic structure of the country, and real shifts in terms of where jobs are, and who gets those jobs, and how able people are to survive on the basis of those jobs. Not just survive, but to really thrive, and to lead a middle class life. I think it's easy to blame those shifts on globalization. I think automation is a very big threat to kind of jobs, and then you start thinking about tax codes that have favored companies and have favored decisions, and the nature of the stock market, and there's just so many different forces that go into the changing economic patterns in the country. But I think one thing we see is that it's really not the last 4 years, but certainly most intensively, is a constituency of people who did not feel represented, and whose views were not represented, and were there to be kind of captured, if you will, as a crass word, by the Republican Party, and kind of pull the Republican Party in a particular direction. So much of this is also bound up in institutional design. How are electoral districts drawn? How does gerrymandering occur? How are elections financed? All of these kinds of rules shape who gets elected, and then who gets elected shapes kind of what kinds of appeals they need in order to be successful in winning elections. So it's, so I would say changes in economic structure, institutional rules, and kind of rhetorical appeals that politicians make in order to kind of mobilize enough people to get them elected and to keep them elected.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Professor Baldez said, and I would just add, it is not new. It feels new constantly, but we're talking about only 50 to 60 years where Black people have had the right to vote in this country. So sort of the polarization has often come in when people feel like someone else getting rights means their rights become less, or the pie is not big enough to share. And we saw, in the lead up to the election of John F. Kennedy, I would say a rebuilding of what the Democratic coalition looked like. There was less of an emphasis on religious factions and more of an emphasis on civil rights leaders and the multiracial coalition that would help elect, and multi-ethnic coalition that would help elect John F. Kennedy president. Now, sadly, if you ask me, my theory is that that coalition really gelled because President Kennedy was assassinated, because, that was a coalition that might have fallen apart over a lot of other partisan issues. And you saw LBJ pick up a lot of President Kennedy's priorities around civil rights and move them forward in a moment of grief for the country, when people thought, you know, this is what we elected this man to do. And it would have been really hard to accomplish. But, you know, in a very difficult moment of unity for the country, they got some important things accomplished that were President Kennedy's agenda. President Obama was the most recent person. 50 years later, we see these cycles of political change about every 50 years. He created a new coalition. He changed the map. He organized differently in states, and he created a coalition that he thankfully, you know, didn't get assassinated over. But that coalition didn't ultimately hold together, right? You saw people snap from Obama to Trump and not feel that their political identity was loyal to the Democratic Party, but just to President Obama. And, you know, thankfully, he wasn't assassinated. We didn't have a moment of emotional reckoning where we had to lose someone or grieve something to keep a coalition together. But what we've learned, I think, from this election is that, I mean, first of all, what, you know, I think Nate Silver pointed out, a political analyst who does a lot of political statistician, he pointed out that since 2000, the Democrats have won the 3 elections where a Black person was on the ticket in the presidential race. We have lost the 3 elections where a Black person was not on the ticket. There is a simple numbers game that Black people continue to vote in the 90+% range for the Democratic Party, and white women and white men continue to vote in the 55% range or more for people like Trump and for you know, white leaders, because they, in many ways, are afraid that they will lose something if Black people have more rights, if brown people have more rights. So we have to keep in mind that we have to reorganize. And just like Professor Baldez said, it involves voting rights, it involves campaign finance reform, it involves redistricting, it involves things that are not very sexy, but that the Republicans pay a lot of attention to disenfranchise people. And I have basically said, you know, the frontier now for winning elections is no longer Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or Michigan or places with a lot of white working class people, because they are going in larger number to the Republicans, but it's the Southwest, where you have a large number of voters who have not shaped their political identity in the same way and are very much up for grabs if you're organized and you're speaking to them. And that, you know, as a Democrat is our work to do that. I keep trying to remind people of.
Speaking of the current election, obviously one of the first and main priorities of this administration is going to be fixing, I don't know, a pandemic, which is going to take a little while. But looking at where what President Biden's agenda was while he was running, what he's been working on since he's become president, do you think there's a chance for the ERA to come back and make a real hit for it? And if it does, would that move us possibly in the direction later on to maybe possibly adopt CDAW, or is that not going to happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are a couple of things going on. Congress has been, members of Congress who have been fighting. They introduce equal right ERA legislation every year for the last, since the deadline for ratification expired in 1982, and they've got the votes to do that. There are 2 lawsuits right now that have been brought about the legitimacy of the deadline for ratification. So the ERA, Congress imposed a deadline on the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, and it expired in 1982. And many are saying that deadline is not constitutional, so that deadline is moot. And Congress has been taking action to adopt legislation to support that view. So part of it depends on what happens in that arena. And then the other question is, right now we're at 35 states that have ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. You need 38. Will the 35 states that have ratified so far, it ran out of gas with 35 states. Now we do have 38 states that have voted to ratify it. Will all those ratifications count as legitimate? And my sense is we're very close. And I think There's a lot of political will for this. There's a lot of political will coming out of the state legislatures to support the Equal Rights Amendment. There's a lot of popular support for it. My own view on the Equal Rights Amendment in terms of what it would do, I'm pretty skeptical of what it will do. The Equal Rights Amendment, I've actually done some research to suggest that, really what the Equal Rights Amendment would do in a constitutional legal sense would maybe change the kinds of criteria that Supreme Court justices use when adjudicating cases of sex discrimination. It is likely that, for example, one of the cases that could come before a country with an ERA, the U.S. with the ERA, could be women serving in combat or women being drafted. And right now, there's a case kind of making its way through lower level courts, brought by men, saying that the all-male draft is unconstitutional, and adopting an Equal Rights Amendment is going to make their case very easy. So it's actually not clear that it's going to benefit women or it's going to have this expansive effect on women's rights. It may have just a more narrow effect on constitutional adjudication, especially with the court that we have right now and the justice that we have sitting on the court. It gets to that question that we were talking about before, about the impact of formal rules, right? And the hope is if you get an ERA in place, it's going to lock everything in place, and it's going to prevent rollback or erosion of the rights that we have, and it's going to hopefully expand the rights that we don't have yet. I think that in conjunction with the kinds of decisions that individual justices make and the rationale for those decisions are the two factors. And I think overall, I just am a little more circumspect about the Equal Rights Amendment having an actual effect on cases. That said, the symbolic effect could be huge, right? The symbolic effect of having a constitution where these young women, for example, look at the Constitution and say, I have a constitution that backs me up here. I think that is really, really important. And I think that in and of itself is worth ratification.
I would also mention, so, in addition to being fully supportive of reintroducing the Equal Rights Amendment, which was never ratified in Vermont, we have a Senator, Ginny Lyons, who served for 20 years, who has, put that back on the table. We also have Proposition 5 in Vermont, which would be a constitutional amendment to enshrine reproductive liberty and freedom in the Constitution, which we have enjoyed a lot of reproductive freedom in the state. We have a Republican governor who has stood up for Planned Parenthood and for abortion rights, which is rare. So I want to give credit to what we're already doing. But, this would probably send a signal to the country that there are ways to even further protect reproductive freedom and liberty. And that is, moving through the constitutional process right now in the state, and is looking very likely to be enshrined into our Constitution in the next 2 to 4 years. I always forget exactly how long the process takes, but it does have to go to a statewide vote. But we're about halfway through the process, and that's a big deal for us to change our Constitution. And I read the language, and it just makes you want to shout it from like the town square, that we're talking about reproductive freedom, that this is language that usually is taken from us, but it's patriotic to allow people, to have freedom over their own bodies. And we're working to enshrine that in law.
Wow.
Thank you, Aziz. I'll see you later. I suppose that runs into my next question rather well, which kind of talks about where we're at in Vermont. You talked a lot about your work starting out in the government, Senator Rahm, in 2009 when we had the Great Depression and the disproportionate help that male-dominated fields were seeing. And now that we're in a somewhat similar situation with COVID-19, which may even have a greater impact because it'll change you know, how it's going to look, what jobs are still there at the end, what, you know, we're going to put our efforts into. Do you think because of the work you and others did at the time in 2009, we're in a better position than we were then? Maybe worse, maybe the same? You know, what are we looking at for making sure assistance is proportionate?
That's a great question. And one of the things we're kind of exploring and poking holes in right now is, what does it mean to have so many women in charge of government? You know, what value does that add to the lives of women who are not in government? You know, because we back then were really pleading with a lot of men in power to be focused on women's issues and our rights and freedoms. And now I was the only woman in my 20s at the time, I believe. Actually, that year there was one other woman. We were two of us in our 20s in the entire 180-person body, and then she left, and I was left alone as the only woman in my 20s. There were far fewer women in leadership roles. We had one woman as Secretary of State, but we had a male treasurer, which we now have a female treasurer. So we have a lot more women in decision-making roles right now. And, you know, I think we're going to start to see, as this session goes on, what value does that add for women in the state? Do we take stock of the fact that this is dubbed a she session and look at increasing unemployment benefits for women with dependents, you know, or people with dependents, which are so often women? Do we look at universal school meals? You know, do we look at starting the conversation about access to childcare? Do we pass paid family leave? You know, I can think of a whole suite of bills that feel like, hey, we have women in charge. Let's show what women can do differently. You know, and at the same time, women face different pressures to look like, you know, worthy leaders, to look like they can balance a budget, you know, those kinds of things. So I am not currently the one in that decision-making role, like our Speaker of the House and our Senate President, both of whom I respect greatly. But I think a lot of women have every right to be disappointed if we leave this session without a huge advance for women and families in the economy and for women in the workplace. So, you know, I'm going to continue to say that in small ways and quiet ways where I can with our leadership, that people are expecting a lot of us and they have every right to.